The harsh voice cut through the tranquil morning air like a blade slicing silk. "This property belongs to the community." The woman's face burned crimson with indignation as she positioned herself between us and our own dock, her eyes fierce. With the intensity of someone prepared to summon authorities, my spouse's friends barely had time to remove their shoes before this stranger drove them away like unwelcome trespassers. The peaceful atmosphere instantly became stifling, with every onlooker's gaze piercing us with that awkward tension you experience when caught in wrongdoing. Would we be forced to retreat in shame? Or was this presumptuous individual about to encounter a reality that would render her speechless? The power struggle at our tranquil retreat was just commencing, and an incredible turnaround awaited just beyond the horizon. You're witnessing this drama unfold, questioning whether entitled individuals truly exist everywhere, correct? Allow me to rewind and explain how we reached this critical moment, because believe me, you'll want to hear every detail. I'm Michael, and 8 months prior, my partner Jessica and I relocated to this stunning waterfront cottage following the most difficult period of our existence. Jessica had recently completed 10 months of oncology treatment, and we determined that what we required above all was a serene location where she could recover, both physically and mentally. The cottage included 3 acres of untouched land, featuring 220 feet of exclusive shoreline that had belonged to the Martinez family for over 4 decades before they transferred it to us. This was meant to be Jessica's celebration occasion, her first genuine social event since completing radiation therapy. It's an opportunity to feel normal again alongside her companions and their children. We had organized a modest waterside gathering, nothing elaborate, just sandwiches and iced tea, and the type of relaxed summer day that reminds you why existence is beautiful. The aroma of coconut oil blended with pine fragrance, children's joy, resonating across the water, and Jessica's authentic smile for the first time in months. Everything was ideal, until it suddenly wasn't. The woman marching toward us appeared as though she had emerged from an exclusive resort magazine. Patricia Blackwood, as she would shortly identify herself, was likely in her mid-40s, with that variety of costly auburn hair requiring bi-weekly appointments. Her cream-colored golf attire was immaculate, her accessories subtle yet expensive, and she moved with the assurance of someone accustomed to immediate compliance. However, something in her expression transcended mere authority. This felt deliberate, personal in a manner that made my flesh crawl. This waterfront is community property overseen by the Riverside Property Owners Association, she proclaimed, her device already recording our startled expressions. Private gatherings are absolutely forbidden without advance authorization, and I'm contacting law enforcement immediately. She positioned her camera to capture the youngsters in the background, likely to portray us as the antagonists, disrupting a peaceful neighborhood space. Our friends began exchanging those uncomfortable looks, indicating they were calculating their quickest escape from this confrontation. I attempted to remain composed, relying on years of experience managing challenging clients in my sustainable design practice. "Miss, I believe there's been some confusion. This is our private property." But Patricia showed no interest in listening. She possessed that righteous anger stemming from absolute certainty in her position, combined with the entitlement that assumes everyone else will surrender when confronted with authority. Jessica had remained silent throughout the entire confrontation, simply observing this woman with those penetrating green eyes that had become even more intense since her illness. I could see her hands trembling slightly. My heart ached thinking about how this was supposed to be her day of celebration, her chance to feel powerful and social again after months of feeling like a patient rather than a person. The children were asking why they couldn't go swimming as promised, and I felt that familiar surge of protective rage that emerges when someone threatens your family. That's when Jessica surprised everyone, including me. She rose slowly from the picnic blanket, brushing grass from her summer dress with deliberate calm. When she spoke, her voice was gentle, but carried clearly across the water with that quiet strength that had sustained her through chemotherapy and everything else life had thrown at us. "Miss, are you aware that this is my private land?" The transformation in Patricia Blackwood was immediate and spectacular. She froze mid-sentence in her call to police, her face shifting from righteous red to pale white in approximately 2 seconds. The phone slipped in her grasp. I watched her carefully constructed authority crumble as she realized she might have just made a very costly mistake. For just a moment, I glimpsed something flicker across her expression that resembled genuine fear. "That's impossible," she stammered, but her voice had lost all its commanding edge. "The HOA manages all waterfront access in this neighborhood. I should know because I'm the Environmental Protection Chairwoman." Even as she said it, though, I could see doubt creeping into her eyes. It's like someone who just realized they might have been playing chess with the wrong pieces. As I watched this woman struggle to maintain her composure while realizing she'd overstepped in a major way. I had no idea that this confrontation was just the opening move in what would become the most intense battle of our lives, the 24 hours following our waterfront. Confrontation felt like watching a small spark grow into a wildfire. I spent that first evening searching through our filing cabinet, retrieving every piece of documentation we had about the property. The deed was crystal clear, signed by Carlos Martinez himself, just 8 months ago. It's transferring ownership of the cottage and exactly 3.1 acres of land, including what the survey marked as 220 feet of private waterfront. The title insurance was current, the property taxes were paid. Everything was legally solid. So why had Patricia Blackwood been so confident in her authority over our land? A quick internet search provided part of the answer, and it wasn't reassuring. Patricia Blackwood wasn't just some overzealous neighbor with excessive free time. She was the former wife of Magistrate William Blackwood, one of the most influential figures in our county's judicial system for the past 12 years. Even divorced. So that kind of connection meant she probably had more influence with local officials than a newcomer like me could ever hope to match. The realization struck me like ice water. Patricia wasn't just asserting her influence randomly. She had the kind of social and political connections that could make our lives very complicated very quickly. Jessica found me at the kitchen table, surrounded by paperwork at nearly midnight, stress eating leftover sandwiches from the ruined gathering. "You're overthinking," she said gently, settling into the chair beside me with that careful movement she still used when exhausted. "What did you discover?" When I showed her the information about Magistrate Blackwood, her face went pale. Then I saw that familiar spark of determination that had carried her through radiation therapy. "So she thinks she can intimidate us because of who she used to be married to?" "It's not just intimidation," I said, scrolling through Patricia's social media profile on my laptop. "Look at this." Her page was filled with posts about neighborhood preservation, property values, and the sacred duty of protecting community character from outside influences. But what caught my attention were the dozens of comments from neighbors I recognized, people who lived within a few miles of our cottage. The language was subtle but clear. Patricia had been building a narrative about new residents who didn't understand or respect local traditions. By the next morning, that narrative had exploded into something much more dangerous. Jessica's friend Amanda called at 6:30 a.m., her voice tight with embarrassment. "I'm so sorry to bother you this early, but you need to know what's happening online." The Riverside Community social media group, which had been a quiet collection of yard sale posts and missing pet alerts, was suddenly buzzing with activity. Patricia had posted a carefully edited video from yesterday's confrontation, complete with dramatic captions about newcomers trying to privatize community waterfront access. The video was a masterpiece of manipulation. She'd edited out the part where Jessica explained about our private property, focusing instead on our friend's uncomfortable expressions and the children asking why they couldn't swim. The comment section was brutal, filled with neighbors-eyed never met expressing outrage about entitled newcomers who thought they could privatize community resources. Within 12 hours, the post had over 150 reactions and was being shared in other local community groups. "We have to respond to this," I told Jessica as we read through comment after comment, questioning our right to live here. But she shook her head, pointing to something I'd missed in my anger. "Look at the group description, Michael. Look at who the administrators are." The Riverside Community social media group had been created just 4 weeks ago, and Patricia Blackwood was listed as the primary administrator. She hadn't just manipulated the narrative, she had created the entire platform for spreading it. That afternoon brought our first real taste of how quickly social media drama could spill into real life. Mrs. Chen, our elderly neighbor who'd been nothing but friendly since we moved in, appeared at our door with a casserole and an apologetic expression. "Hope you don't mind me asking," she said carefully, "but some folks are saying there might be some confusion about the waterfront boundaries, Patricia. Blackwood has been very active in the community groups, and she seems to know an awful lot about property law." The poor woman was uncomfortable, but I could see the doubt in her eyes. For days after the initial confrontation, Patricia escalated. Her campaign with the community meeting that she'd somehow organized faster than should have been humanly possible. The flyer was distributed through the social media group and hand-delivered to every house within a 3-mile radius. It's announced an emergency community preservation meeting to address threats to shared waterfront access. The meeting was scheduled for that very evening at the community center, and attendance was strongly encouraged for all concerned citizens. Jessica and I arrived at the community center to find the parking lot fuller than I'd ever seen it. Inside, Patricia had set up a presentation complete with slideshow slides about property values, community rights, and the importance of preserving access to natural resources for families. She'd positioned herself behind a podium like she was campaigning for office, wearing a burgundy blazer that screamed authority and competence. The audience was packed with familiar faces from around the lake, plus quite a few people I didn't recognize, but who were nodding along with every word she said. Private waterfront ownership, Patricia was explaining as we took seats in the back, represents a fundamental threat to the community character that makes this area special. When outside investors buy up waterfront property and exclude long-time residents from access they've enjoyed for decades, we all lose something precious. The way she said outside investors, while looking directly at us, made it clear who the villains were supposed to be in her story. Just as Patricia was building to what seemed like a call for community action against us, the back door of the community center opened with a bang that made everyone turn around. My father-in-law Robert stood in the doorway, still wearing his Veterans of Foreign Wars cap and leaning heavily on the walking stick he'd carried since his hip surgery at 70. Robert was still an imposing figure with the kind of quiet authority that came from 28 years in the Navy and absolute confidence in his moral compass. Robert walked slowly down the center aisle, his walking stick tapping against the floor with each deliberate step until he reached the front of the room. The entire crowd had gone silent, sensing that something significant was about to happen. He turned to face Patricia at her podium, and when he spoke, his voice carried the kind of commanding presence that made everyone sit up straighter. Robert said, his words crisp and clear, "You'd better have legal documentation before you start accusing my family of anything." Patricia's face went through several shades of red as she stared down my father-in-law, clearly not expecting to be challenged by a decorated veteran in front of her carefully assembled audience. She fumbled with her presentation remote, clicking past slides about community preservation until she reached what looked like an official survey report. "Sir, I'm sorry, I don't know your name," she said, trying to regain her composure, "but I have documentation right here from a certified land surveyor confirming that the waterfront in question falls under community easement provisions established by the original development covenant." Robert didn't move from his position at the front of the room, but I could see the slight smile that meant he was about to demolish someone's argument with military precision. "Robert Morrison, United States Navy, retired," he said clearly, making sure everyone in the room knew exactly who they were dealing with. "And ma'am, I'd like to see the credentials of this surveyor, the date of this survey, and the specific legal language of these easement provisions you're citing. Because my daughter and son-in-law have their survey conducted by Martinez and Associates just 8 months ago that shows clear private ownership of that entire waterfront section." The room erupted in murmurs as people turned to look at us with new interest. I could see the calculation in Patricia's eyes as she realized that this wasn't going to be the easy steamroll she'd planned. She clicked to another slide, this one, showing what appeared to be a map with property boundaries. But even from the back of the room, I could see that the image quality was poor and the details were hard to make out. "The survey I'm referencing was conducted by Apex Land Services last month," she said, her voice gaining confidence again. "They're a highly respected firm that has worked extensively in this area." That's when I realized I needed to step up and Support Robert because something about Patricia's presentation wasn't adding up. I stood up from my seat in the back, feeling every eye in the room turn toward me. I'm Michael Thompson. I'm an environmental architect with 12 years of experience reading land surveys and development plans. I announced, my professional credentials giving me the authority to challenge her technical claims. Ms. Blackwood, would you mind sharing the contact information for Apex Land Services? Because I'd like to verify their certification with the state licensing board. The request hit Patricia like a physical blow. She stepped back from the podium, hurt perfectly, composed expression cracking for just a moment before she managed to pull it back together. I don't think it's appropriate to turn this community meeting into an interrogation, she said, but her voice had lost that commanding edge. The important issue here is protecting our shared community resources from privatization, not getting bogged down in technical details. But Robert wasn't finished with her yet. Took another step forward, close enough that Patricia had to look up to meet his eyes, and spoke with the kind of quiet authority that had probably terrified countless young sailors over the years. Ma'am, when you accuse people of stealing community property, technical details are the only thing that matters. Either you have legal standing to make these claims, or you don't. And if you don't, then you're conducting what amounts to a harassment. Campaigned against my family. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. I could see neighbors whispering to each other, some looking concerned about the accusations flying back and forth, others uncomfortable with the aggressive tone the meeting had taken. Jessica, who had been sitting quietly beside me through the whole confrontation, suddenly stood up and walked to the front of the room to stand beside her father. I'd like to say something, Jessica announced, her voice soft, but carrying clearly through the community center. The room fell silent, and I felt a surge of pride watching my wife command attention without raising her voice or making threats. 8 months ago, I finished treatment for breast cancer. My husband and I bought our cottage because we needed a peaceful place where I could heal, where we could rebuild our life together after the hardest year we'd ever experienced. This lake, this property, represents hope for us. It's where I'm learning to feel strong again. She paused, looking around the room at faces that had gone from hostile to uncertain to sympathetic.
Oh.
I don't understand why anyone would want to take that away from us, especially based on survey reports that can't be verified. If there's a legitimate legal issue with our property ownership, then let's resolve it through proper channels. But turning our neighbors against us with social media, campaigns and community meetings based on questionable documentation doesn't seem like the right way to handle a property dispute. The effect of Jessica's words was immediate and powerful. Several people in the audience looked genuinely ashamed, and I could see Patricia's support starting to erode in real time. Mrs. Chen got up from her seat and walked over to hug Jessica, whispering an apology that I couldn't hear but could understand from the body language. Other neighbors began to follow her lead. And suddenly Patricia found herself standing alone at the podium while half her audience was offering sympathy and support to the people she'd been trying to vilify. Patricia tried to regain control of the situation, but the momentum had shifted completely. "Ladies and gentlemen, please," she called out, tapping her microphone to get attention. "We can't let personal sympathy cloud our judgment about important community issues. Property law doesn't care about individual circumstances, and we have to protect everyone's interests, not just one family's emotional needs." But her words fell flat in a room where people were now seeing us as neighbors who'd been unfairly attacked rather than outside threats to their community. Robert Lasona took advantage of the moment to deliver what I could tell was going to be his closing argument. "Ma'am, you've made serious accusations against my family based on survey reports you can't verify, conducted by companies you won't provide contact information for. Regarding easements you can't cite specific legal language for. In the Navy, we have a word for that kind of behavior, and it's not a word I'd use in polite company." As the meeting broke up with neighbors approaching us to apologize and offer support, I noticed Patricia hurriedly packing up her presentation materials with shaky hands. But just before she left, I caught her making a phone call in the parking lot, speaking in urgent, hushed tones to someone who was not happy about how the evening had gone. Whatever Patricia's next move was going to be, I had a feeling that tonight's public embarrassment had only made her more determined to find a way to win this fight, Patricia's phone call in the parking lot turned out to be more ominous than I'd realized the next morning. I woke up to find orange plastic barriers surrounding our entire waterfront, complete with official-looking signs declaring contaminated area, do not enter, and environmental hazard, authorized personnel only. My coffee mug nearly slipped from my hands as I stared out our kitchen window at what looked like a crime scene where our peaceful dock used to be. Jessica appeared beside me, still in her robe, and I could see her hands starting to shake with the kind of anger that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with pure outrage. "She actually did it," Jessica whispered, her voice tight with disbelief. "She's trying to make people think our property is dangerous." The signs were professionally printed and looked official enough that anyone driving by would assume there was a legitimate environmental concern. But I knew there was no contamination, no environmental hazard. Nothing but Patricia's desperate attempt to justify her claims about community safety. The question was, how had she gotten these barriers up overnight, and what authority was she claiming to act under? I called Rachel Stevens, the environmental law attorney that Mrs. Chen had recommended after the community meeting. Rachel had a reputation for taking on cases where individuals were being steamrolled by organizations with more money and political connections, and she agreed to meet us that afternoon to assess the situation. When she arrived with a professional surveyor and what looked like a small drone in a carrying case, I realized we were about to fight fire with very sophisticated fire. "This is interesting," Rachel said, examining the contamination signs with a magnifying glass, like she was investigating a forgery. "These signs reference EPA regulation codes that don't exist, and the company name listed as the environmental assessment firm isn't registered with the state. Whoever put these up is betting that most people won't check the details. But they've made some basic legal errors that could get them in serious trouble." She handed me the magnifying glass so I could see the microscopic print that revealed the signs to be high-quality fakes. The surveyor, meanwhile, was setting up equipment that looked like it belonged in a NASA mission. "We're going to do a complete drone mapping of your property boundaries," he explained, calibrating what appeared to be a very expensive piece of technology. "This will give us GPS-accurate measurements that can be verified by satellite data and will create a 3D visualization that shows exactly where your property lines are in relation to the lake, the barriers, and any neighboring properties." The drone took off with a high-tech whirry sound. I felt like we were finally bringing the right weapons to this fight. While the survey was being conducted, Rachel was making phone calls that revealed the scope of Patricia's operation. "Your friend Patricia has been busy," she told us, scrolling through notes on her tablet. "She's filed complaints with the County Environmental Office, the Health Department, and the Water Quality Board, all claiming that recent construction on your property has created contamination risks for the lake. The complaints reference the same fake EPA codes as the signs, but they've been submitted to 3 different government agencies. But we haven't done any construction," Jessica protested, looking around our property as if she might have missed a major renovation project. "The most we've done is plant some flowers and repair a loose board on the dock." Rachel nodded grimly, making more notes on her tablet. "That's the genius of her strategy. She's not claiming you've contaminated anything. She's claiming that your potential to contaminate something requires immediate preventive action. It's much harder to prove a negative, and it puts the burden on you to demonstrate that you're not a threat." That's when the surveyor called us over to see what his drone had discovered, and I felt my jaw drop as I looked at the data displayed on his laptop screen. "According to the GPS coordinates and the original property survey, you own 75 more feet of waterfront than you realized," he announced, pointing to a detailed map that showed our property extending well beyond where we'd thought the boundaries were. The previous owners weren't using the full extent of their waterfront rights. But legally, you have access to 295 feet of shoreline, not the 220 feet you thought you owned. The implications hit me immediately. If we owned more of the waterfront than even we had realized, then Patricia's claims about community access were even more ridiculous than we'd thought. But it also meant that some of the areas where neighbors had been swimming and fishing for years were technically our private property, which could make this situation much more complicated from a community relations standpoint. Rachel was already thinking 3 moves ahead. "We need to document everything and go public with the real facts before Patricia can spin this new information to make you look like greedy property grabbers," she said, pulling out her phone and starting to make calls. "I'm going to contact Tyler Jackson. He's a local social media influencer who specializes in exposing fake news and community drama. If Patricia wants to play the public opinion game, we need someone who understands how to win it." Tyler Jackson turned out to be a 20-something guy with the kind of energy that came from drinking too much coffee and caring deeply about justice. He arrived with professional camera equipment and immediately started filming the fake contamination signs, explaining to his phone camera why the EPA codes didn't exist, and how to verify environmental claims through official government websites. "This is exactly the kind of local corruption that my followers love to see exposed," he told us, his enthusiasm infectious. "By tomorrow morning, this video will have more views than Patricia's social media group has members." But Patricia wasn't finished with her escalation campaign. Just as Tyler was wrapping up his filming, a county sheriff's car pulled into our driveway with lights flashing. Deputy Martinez stepped out, looking uncomfortable but determined, and approached us with an official-looking document in his hand. "I'm sorry to bother you folks, but I have a complaint here alleging trespassing on community property, and I need to ask you to step away from the waterfront area while we sort this out." Jessica's face went pale, and I felt that familiar surge of protective anger. "Deputy Martinez, this is our private property, and we have the surveys and deed to prove it," I said, trying to keep my voice calm while Tyler continued filming the entire interaction. "The person who filed this complaint has no legal authority over our land, and she's been conducting a harassment campaign against my family for over a week now." Deputy Martinez looked genuinely conflicted, glancing between his paperwork and our obvious distress. "I understand your position, Mr. Thompson, but I have to follow up on all complaints. And this one comes with what appears to be documentation from the Riverside Property Owners Association claiming jurisdiction over waterfront access." He showed me a folder thick with papers that looked official enough to be convincing. But I was beginning to understand Patricia's strategy of overwhelming people with fake authority. That's when we heard another car pulling up our driveway, and I turned to see Sheriff Rodriguez himself getting out of an unmarked vehicle. Sheriff Rodriguez was a man I'd helped 3 years ago, designing an addition to his house pro bono when he couldn't afford an architect. And I could see from his expression that he was not happy about what he was seeing at our property. "Deputy Martinez," Sheriff Rodriguez called out in a voice that carried absolute authority. "You need to step back and let me handle this situation." Sheriff Rodriguez walked toward us with the kind of measured pace that meant he was thinking carefully about every word he was about to say. Deputy Martinez looked like he wanted to disappear into the ground as his superior approached, clutching the complaint paperwork like it might protect him from what was clearly about to be an uncomfortable conversation. "Deputy Martinez," Sheriff Hugh Rodriguez said in a voice that carried decades of law enforcement authority, "I need you to explain to me why you're threatening to arrest a property owner on his land based on complaints filed by someone with no legal standing whatsoever." "Sir, I was responding to documentation from the Riverside Property Owners Association," Deputy Martinez stammered, holding up the thick folder that Patricia had provided. "The complaint alleges trespassing on community property with supporting surveys and legal precedents." Sheriff Rodriguez took the folder and spent several minutes examining the documents, his expression growing darker with each page he turned. Tyler Jackson continued filming the entire exchange, and I could see him practically vibrating with excitement at capturing what was going to be a very dramatic moment. "Deputy Martinez, this documentation is fraudulent," Sheriff Rodriguez announced, loud enough for Tyler's camera to pick up clearly. "The Riverside Property Owners Association that issued these complaints was dissolved 7 years ago, according to county records, and someone has been forging signatures and creating fake legal documents to support harassment claims against the Thompson family." He turned to look directly at our property, then back at the fake contamination signs. Furthermore, those environmental hazard warnings reference EPA regulations that don't exist and claim authority from state agencies that have no jurisdiction over private property disputes. The relief I felt was overwhelming, but it was quickly replaced by a new kind of anger as the full scope of Patricia's deception became clear. She hadn't just been difficult or overzealous about community preservation. She had been conducting an elaborate fraud operation complete with forged documents, like government complaints, and fraudulent environmental claims. The question was, why would someone go to such extreme lengths to harass a family they barely knew? Sheriff Rodriguez wasn't finished with his revelations. Mr. Thompson, I've been investigating Patricia Blackwood's activities for the past 4 days after receiving multiple complaints about her behavior at community meetings and online harassment campaigns, he continued, pulling out his folder of documentation. What we've discovered is that Mrs. Blackwood has been in preliminary negotiations with Aquasplash Entertainment Corporation for the past 3 months, discussing the possibility of converting this entire waterfront area into a commercial water park and entertainment complex. The words hit me like a physical blow. Jessica staggered backward, and I had to grab her arm to steady her as the implications sank in. This wasn't about community preservation or property rights or environmental protection. This was about money, specifically about Patricia's plan to profit from forcing us, another waterfront property owners, to sell our land to a commercial development company. The cancer treatment, the peaceful recovery space, the place where Jessica was learning to feel strong again, all of it was just an obstacle to Patricia's business deal. According to the preliminary agreements we've obtained through a court order, Sheriff Rodriguez continued, his voice growing more grim with each detail. Mrs. Blackwood was set to receive 18% of all revenue generated by the Aquasplash facility, in exchange for facilitating the acquisition of waterfront properties through legal challenges and community pressure campaigns. The plan was to establish precedent that private waterfront ownership could be challenged on community access grounds, then use that precedent to force sales to the development company at below-market prices. Tyler Jackson was frantically taking notes while continuing to film, probably realizing that he'd stumbled onto a story much bigger than simple neighbor drama. Sheriff Rodriguez, how many other property owners were targeted by this scheme? He asked, his journalistic instincts kicking in. The answer was even more disturbing than I'd expected. We've identified 14 other waterfront families who received similar harassment and fake legal challenges over the past 8 months, Sheriff Rodriguez replied. The Thompson family just happened to be the most recent targets, and their decision to fight back publicly exposed the entire operation. Rachel Stevens had been taking detailed notes throughout Sheriff Rodriguez's explanation, and I could see her legal mind working through the implications. Sheriff, this constitutes conspiracy to commit fraud, forgery of legal documents, filing false reports with government agencies, and possibly extortion depending on how the threats were structured, she said, her voice tight with professional anger. Patricia Blackwood isn't just facing harassment charges anymore. She's looking at potential federal crimes if any of this crossed state lines or involved fraudulent use of government agency identities. That's when Jessica surprised everyone by stepping forward and addressing Sheriff Rodriguez directly. I don't understand is how she thought she could get away with this, Jessica said, her voice stronger than I'd heard it since her treatment ended. Didn't she realize that eventually someone would check her documentation and discover the forgeries? Sheriff Rodriguez's expression softened as he looked at my wife, probably recognizing the kind of quiet strength that had carried her through cancer and was now carrying her through this nightmare. Mrs. Thompson, people like Patricia Blackwood, often succeed with these schemes because most folks don't have the resources or knowledge to challenge fake authority, he explained. She was counting on intimidating you into selling or simply giving up your property rights rather than fighting back through proper legal channels. The fact that you had family support, legal representation, and community allies who were willing to stand up for you is what brought down her entire operation. As Sheriff Rodriguez was explaining the scope of Patricia's fraud, I noticed a black sedan pulling up our driveway with corporate license plates that I didn't recognize. 3 people in business suits got out, led by a woman in her 40s who had the kind of expensive briefcase that meant serious corporate legal representation. That would be the Aquasplash legal team, Sheriff Rodriguez said grimly. They've been trying to distance themselves from Patricia ever since we served them with court orders requiring disclosure of their development agreements. The lead attorney approached our group with the cautious manner of someone who knew they were walking into a legal minefield. Mr. Thompson, I'm Victoria Hamilton, General Counsel for Aquasplash Entertainment Corporation, she announced, offering a business card. That I didn't take. We're here to inform you that our company is terminating all agreements with Patricia Blackwood, effective immediately. And we want to make it clear that Aquasplash did not know about any fraudulent activities or harassment campaigns conducted on our behalf. But Rachel Stevens wasn't impressed by corporate damage control? Ms. Hamilton, your company entered into preliminary agreements to purchase property that you knew was privately owned, based on legal challenges that you helped fund through payments. To Patricia Blackwood, she said, her voice cutting through the attorney's carefully prepared talking points, the fact that you're now claiming ignorance about her methods doesn't absolve your company of responsibility for the results of those methods. As I watched Patricia's entire scheme crumble around her, with sheriff's deputies, corporate lawyers, and social media influencers all documenting the collapse of her fraud operation, I realized that our quiet waterside recovery story had turned into something much larger than we'd ever imagined. The question now was whether justice would actually be served, or whether Patricia's political connections would somehow allow her to escape the consequences of what she'd done to our family and 13 other innocent property owners. As someone who's been documenting these kinds of community legal battles here in Phoenix, I'm curious about your perspective on this situation. Do you think corporate developers should face criminal charges when they fund harassment campaigns against private property owners? Or should the legal consequences focus solely on the individuals who commit the fraud? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to stay tuned for the final chapters where we'll see exactly how this battle ends. The Aquasplash legal team's attempt at damage control was interrupted by the arrival of yet another unexpected player in our increasingly complex drama. A sleek silver Lexus pulled up behind the corporate sedan. I watched in amazement as Magistrate William Blackwood himself stepped out of the driver's seat. The man looked exactly like what Central Casting would order for a distinguished county magistrate, with silver hair, an expensive suit, and the kind of bearing that commanded respect in any courtroom. But his expression was thunderous as he approached our group, and I could see that Patricia's ex-husband was not here to support her latest scheme. Victoria, Magistrate Blackwood addressed the Aquasplash attorney with the familiarity of someone who'd probably dealt with corporate legal teams for years. I need to speak with you privately about terminating any remaining financial obligations your company may have to my former wife. His voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to having his words treated as final judgments. But there was also an undertone of embarrassment that suggested he knew exactly how this situation reflected on his reputation. Patricia, who had been conspicuously absent since the fake contamination signs appeared, chose that moment to make her dramatic entrance. She pulled up in a white Mercedes with what appeared to be 2 paralegal assistants and a man in a cheap suit who was probably supposed to look like legitimate legal representation, stepping out of her car with the confidence of someone who still believed she could control the narrative. Patricia surveyed the crowd that had gathered on our property like a general assessing a battlefield she was confident of winning. "William, what are you doing here?" Patricia demanded, her voice carrying across our lawn with the kind of sharp edge that suggested their divorce had been particularly unpleasant. "This is a private property matter that has nothing to do with your judicial responsibilities." But Magistrate Blackwood's response made it clear that he was here in a personal capacity, and he was not happy about having his name associated with her activities. "Patricia, the State Ethics Board contacted me this morning about your use of my name and former judicial connections to intimidate private citizens and file fraudulent legal documents," Magistrate Blackwood announced loud enough for Tyler Jackson's camera to capture every word. "I'm here to publicly disavow any connection to your harassment campaign.